For nearly 48 years, one part of Graceland stayed completely sealed while millions of visitors walked through the mansion. Most of those who knew about it were gone, and those who remained stayed silent. But recently, a small team finally broke the seal, and what they found changed everything that had been assumed about Elvis Presley's private life. So, what was hidden up there? Let's discover. The space above. Graceland had been open to the public for decades. Millions of people had walked through its front doors, moved through its decorated rooms, and stood in front of the glass case that held Elvis Presley's white jumpsuits and gold records. They had seen the jungle room, the trophy building, and the meditation garden where Elvis was buried. They had read the plaques and studied the photographs. But not one of them had ever seen what was above all of it. The attic sat at the top of the house like a closed chapter, and for nearly 48 years, nobody opened it. When Elvis passed away in August 1977, Graceland went through a series of transformation. His father, Vernon Presley, took control of the estate and made decisions quickly, partly out of necessity and partly out of grief. The mansion needed to be managed, the finances needed to be stabilized, and eventually, it was decided that opening Graceland to the public would be the best way to preserve it. That process took a few years, but by 1982, visitors were walking through rooms that had once been completely private. The attic, however, was never part of that plan. It was sealed, and the decision to leave it that way was never formally explained, although there were practical reasons that people pointed to over the years. The attic was not a finished space. It was low, warm, and difficult to access, and nobody had made any effort to prepare it for foot traffic or display. But those reasons only explain why it was not part of the tour. They did not explain why it had never been properly sorted through, cataloged, or even opened for internal review. The rest of Graceland had been gone through carefully, well except for the private upstairs area, primarily Elvis Presley's bedroom and bathroom, which have remained off limits since his passing in 1977. This space is kept exactly as he left it. Every other room had been assessed, every item had been considered, but the attic was the one place that had simply been forgotten, and over time, that aspect became something that people just accepted without asking too many questions about it. Among the small group of people who managed Graceland over the decades, the attic was treated as a part of the house that existed outside of normal operations. It often came up in meetings about preservation and estate management, but those conversations never led anywhere concrete. There was always something more pressing to deal with, or the timing never felt right, or someone with authority over the decision wasn't ready to move forward. The result was that year after year, the attic stayed sealed without much concern for it. Part of what made the attic different from the rest of Graceland was its relationship to Elvis's final years. By the mid-1970s, his life had become much more private and much more complicated. He had retreated from a lot of the public-facing version of himself and spent more time at Graceland than anywhere else. The people around him during that period were a tight, loyal circle, and the things that went on in that house during those years were not always things that ended up in official records or public statements. And during that time, the attic was where Elvis found solace. Graceland itself had changed enormously since those years. It had become one of the most visited private homes in the United States, a place that drew people from every part of the world who wanted to feel connected to Elvis in some way. The estate had grown into a significant business with museums, hotels, and entertainment venues built up around the original property. All of that development had been built on a carefully maintained version of Elvis's story, one that celebrated his music, his generosity, and his cultural impact. The attic wasn't a part of it. The people who worked at Graceland over the years were not oblivious of the attic's presence. It was physically part of the house they moved through every day, and its existence was not a secret. But there was an unspoken understanding that it was not something to be discussed with visitors or pushed as a subject of interest. Workers learned that certain topics were handled carefully, and the attic fell into that category without anyone ever spelling out exactly why. It was understood that it had been left alone for a reason, even if that reason was never clearly stated. By the time serious conversations began about finally opening it, nearly half a century had passed since Elvis passed away. The people who had made the original decision to seal it were no longer around to explain their thinking. The estate was operating in a very different environment than it had been in 1977, with new pressures, new leadership, and new questions about what Graceland's future would look like. Whatever was inside that attic had been waiting for a very long time, and the moment when that wait would finally end was already near. A forgotten sanctuary. In the years leading up to the final decision, the Graceland estate had been dealing with a series of legal and financial pressures that forced a closer look at every part of the property. There had been disputes over ownership, questions about how the estate was being managed, and growing scrutiny from outside parties who had an interest in how Elvis's legacy was being handled. In that environment, leaving a sealed and uncatalogued space inside the main house became harder to justify. The attic, which had been easy to ignore for long, suddenly became something that needed to be addressed. Archivists and preservation specialists had been making the case for years that the attic needed attention. Their concern was not primarily about what might be discovered, but about what might be lost. Old materials stored in an unregulated space were vulnerable to heat, humidity, and deterioration. Paper breaks down, fabric rots, and recorded media becomes unplayable if it is not stored properly. Every year that passed without an assessment was a year in which irreplaceable items could be gradually ruined. That argument had been made before without much effect, but in the new climate surrounding the estate, it carried more weight. The practical case for opening the attic finally aligned with the pressures that were already forcing a review of how Graceland operated. However, the decision couldn't be rushed. Opening the attic meant potentially surfacing things that had been put away for reasons that were never recorded. There were people connected to the estate who had strong feelings about the attic and about what it might contain. Some of those people were protective of Elvis's memory in a very specific way, not the general public version of it, but the private version that those closest to him had carried for decades. Having to deal with whatever was up there on its own terms, without the benefit of the context that the people who had placed those items there could have provided, created uncertainty. That uncertainty made some people cautious. A small team was eventually assembled to handle the opening. The group included people with expertise in archival preservation, estate management, and the specific history of Graceland and its contents. The team was kept small, partly for practical reasons and partly because everyone involved understood that what they were about to do needed to be handled with a level of discretion that a larger group would make difficult. Before the door was touched, a plan was put in place for how items would be documented, how they would be handled, and who would have access to information about what was found. That plan took time to develop and was revised several times before it was considered ready. The physical preparation for the opening was also in order. The area around the attic access was assessed for structural integrity, and the environment inside was tested as much as possible without breaking the seal. Next, equipment was brought in to help manage temperature and humidity during the process, because the act of opening a long, sealed space could itself accelerate deterioration if the conditions changed too rapidly. Lighting was set up so that the team could see clearly without exposing sensitive materials to unnecessary stress. Every step was thought through in advance because the people involved understood that there would be no second chance to do this for the first time. On the day the attic was opened, the atmosphere inside Graceland was noticeably different from a normal working day. But the visitors going through the public areas of the property had no idea what was happening in the part of the house closed to them. The team gathered at the access point with their equipment and their documentation materials, and for a moment before anything was touched, there was a stillness that everyone in the room seemed to feel. The door had not been opened in close to half a century. The people who had sealed it were gone. The attic had become the last unexamined part of a place that had otherwise been studied, documented, and presented to the world in extraordinary detail. Whatever was on the other side had been sitting in the dark since before most of the team members had been old enough to remember Elvis as a living person. When it was time, the seal was broken carefully, with attention paid to every detail of the process. The first thing the team noticed was the air, which carried a strange, heavy feeling, like a place that had stayed sealed for a very long time. It felt different from the outside world, almost untouched by time. Then the light slowly pushed its way inside as the team moved forward, careful and focused, trying to understand where they had stepped into. As the brightness spread across the space, their eyes began to adjust. Shapes started to appear from the darkness, but none of them were clear at first. There was a large amount of material inside, stacked and arranged in rows and clusters. It looked organized, not random, suggesting that someone had once carefully decided what belonged there and how everything should be stored. The first moments of the opening made one thing immediately clear. Whatever was in the attic, it was not nothing. The space was full, and the material inside it was going to take a significant amount of time to go through properly. The team began their documentation process with the systematic discipline they had prepared for, but the sense in the room was already shifting from professional readiness into something closer to genuine astonishment. The attic had been treated for decades as a blank space on the map of Graceland, yet it wasn't blank at all, the personal layers. What the team first encountered were things that were folded carefully and placed in containers that had held their shape surprisingly well over the decades. The initial layer of items inside the attic was made up of clothing, not stage costumes or the elaborate performance wear that people associated with Elvis, but ordinary clothes. Shirts, trousers, casual items that would not have looked out of place on any man of his era. They were personal in a way that the jumpsuits and jeweled capes in the museum downstairs were not. The clothing alone took time to work through. Each item had to be carefully removed, assessed for condition, and documented before it was set aside. Some pieces were in surprisingly good shape given how long they had been stored. Others showed the effects of decades in an unregulated environment, with fabric weakened or discolored by the conditions. But even the damaged items were handled with the same level of attention as the rest, because the team understood that condition was only one part of what made something significant. The fact that these clothes had belonged to Elvis and had been stored away from the world for nearly 50 years made each piece worth treating carefully, regardless of its physical state. They had been worn privately in the house, away from cameras and crowds, and they carried that quality in a way that was noticeable to everyone in the room. Among the clothing, the team began to find paper, letters, notes, and handwritten pages that had been stored alongside the personal items rather than separately. Some of the paper was in fragile condition, and handling it required additional care to avoid further damage. The content of what was written was not something the team could spend time absorbing in detail as they worked. But even in the process of documenting and setting items aside, it was clear that these were not formal documents or business records. The handwriting was personal, the tone was private, and the subjects being addressed were the kinds of things people write when they are not expecting anyone else to read their words. The notes and letters added a layer to the discovery that the clothing alone had not. Physical objects from someone's private life carry a certain kind of weight, but written words carry something more direct. They give a person back their own voice in a way that nothing else does. What the team was finding was not the Elvis of the stage and the screen, but something much closer to the man who had lived in that house and moved through those rooms in the years before his death. The gap between those two versions of the same person was something that researchers and biographers had always struggled with. And the material in the attic was beginning to close that gap in ways that nobody had fully anticipated. As they moved further through the initial layer of material, the team found items that were harder to categorize. Personal objects that had obvious meaning, but no explanation. Things that had been kept for reasons that were not written on them, placed alongside other things, which suggested association rather than random storage. There were items connected to people in Elvis's life, objects that pointed to relationships and moments that had never been part of the public record. None of it was scandalous, but all of it was deeply human. That realization shifted the atmosphere of the room as the team worked through it. One of the things that struck the team most strongly in those early hours was the evidence of intentional organization. The items had not been thrown into the attic in a hurry or piled up without thought. Someone had taken time with this. Things had been wrapped, folded, and placed with a degree of care that indicated intention. Whatever had been put in this attic had been put there purposefully by someone who expected it to stay there, seeing that raised questions that the objects themselves could not answer. The decision to store these things so carefully and then to leave them untouched for decades pointed to a set of circumstances that the team could only begin to piece together from what they were finding. The personal nature of the first discoveries set a tone for the entire process that the team carried with them as they worked. This was not an archaeological dig through a stranger's belongings. It was a rare look into the private interior of one of the most publicly examined lives of the 20th century. Every item they handled had been part of a real person's daily existence, chosen and used and eventually set aside for reasons that had now outlasted almost everyone who would have understood them. The museum floors below held the version of Elvis that the world had always known. The attic held the version that had never been shown, and the difference between the two was becoming clearer with every item the team lifted from the space. The deeper discoveries. past the personal items and the carefully folded clothing, the character of the attic changed. The further the team moved into the space, the less the contents resembled the private remnants of a personal life, and the more they began to feel like something that had been put away with a specific kind of intention. The items in this deeper section of the attic were not random. They had been placed there on purpose, and the way they were arranged suggested that whoever had done it understood exactly what they were storing and why it needed to be kept out of sight. The recorded material was among the first things in this section to draw the team's attention. There were tapes, the kind used for audio recording in the 1970s, stored in a way that had protected them better than might have been expected given the conditions. The team could not play them in the attic, and their full assessment would have to wait for proper equipment and a controlled environment, but even the physical presence of unheard recordings was significant. Elvis had recorded a massive amount of material throughout his life, and the catalog of what was officially known was considered to be largely complete. The existence of recordings that had never been cataloged or accounted for brought up a question that the team could not yet answer but could not ignore. Then alongside the recordings, there were written documents of a more formal character than the personal notes found earlier. These were papers that had the quality of records, correspondence that had passed between parties with specific purposes. Some of it involved names and subjects that connected to aspects of Elvis's professional and personal life that had been written about in broad terms but never fully documented. The team moved through this material carefully, aware that they were handling things that had been kept separate from the official record for reasons that were not clear at that point, but that someone had clearly considered important enough to act on. What made these documents particularly striking was not any single piece of information they contained, but the pattern they suggested when considered together. Elvis's public story had been shaped over the decades by the accounts of the people who had been closest to him, by authorized biographies and estate-approved narratives, and by the careful management of what information was released and when. The material in the deeper section of the attic did not contradict that story. Rather, it added dimensions to it that had never been visible before. There were also objects in this section that pointed to specific relationships in Elvis's life without fully explaining them. Personal items that belonged to other people. Things that had clearly been given to Elvis or left in his possession for reasons that were no longer recoverable. Some of these objects connected to people who had been important in his life, but who had not always been part of the official telling of his story. Others pointed to periods of his life that were less documented, the years when he was most private and most withdrawn from the demands of his career. Taken individually, each item was simply an object. Taken together, they formed a picture of a life that was considerably more complex than the one that had been presented to the public. This discovery revealed conversations and relationships that had existed beneath the surface of the public account, and that had apparently been considered too sensitive or too complicated to be part of the version of Elvis that was shared with the world. The question of how long this material had been known about by people connected to the estate was one that the team could not answer from the contents of the attic alone. Some of what they found had clearly been placed there during Elvis's lifetime, or very shortly after his passing, but other items appeared to have been added at points that came somewhat later, suggesting that the attic had not been completely sealed from the beginning, and that someone with access to it had used it as a place to store things on more than one occasion. That possibility introduced a level of complexity that went beyond simple historical discovery, and into territory that raised questions about decisions made by people who were no longer available to explain themselves. By the time the team had worked through this deeper section, the nature of what they were dealing with had shifted considerably from what they had encountered in the first hours. The early discoveries had been moving and humanizing, the private pieces of a private man. What lay alongside them was something more complicated, material that carried the weight of choices made over decades about what would be remembered and what would be kept out of sight. None of it had deteriorated beyond recovery. All of it had been waiting, completely undisturbed and in the dark, for the moment when someone would finally come looking. The implications of the discovery. When the team finished its initial pass through the attic, the scale of what had been uncovered was clear enough to understand even before any of the material had been fully assessed. There was a great deal of it, more than anyone had anticipated, and it covered a range of types and conditions that would require different approaches and different kinds of expertise to handle properly. The immediate priority was stabilization. Items that were fragile or showing signs of deterioration were given urgent attention, moved into conditions where further damage could be slowed or stopped. The recorded material was flagged for specialist handling. The written documents were placed in protective storage. The personal objects were cataloged and secured. The work of preservation came before any other consideration, because without it, the question of what to do with the discoveries became irrelevant. The authentication process that followed the initial recovery was extensive. Each item needed to be verified, its origins established as clearly as possible, its condition assessed in detail, and its relationship to the broader body of material from the attic documented. Some items were straightforward. Clothing and personal objects with clear provenance required less investigative work than documents or recordings whose context was less immediately legible. The recorded material in particular required a careful and technically demanding process before anyone could even begin to understand what had been captured and when. Teams with specific expertise were brought in for different categories of material, and the work was conducted in stages to ensure that nothing was missed and nothing was compromised by moving too quickly. As the authentication work progressed, the people overseeing the estate were confronted with a set of decisions that had no simple answers. The material from the attic fell into categories that carried very different implications. Some of it was historically significant right away. Items that added to the documented record of Elvis's life and work without introducing complications beyond their cultural and archival value. That category was the easiest to manage, and plans for how it might eventually be presented to the public or integrated into the existing Graceland collections were discussed relatively early in the process. The path for that material was at least clear in outline. Other material was considerably more difficult to categorize. The documents and correspondence that touched on relationships, decisions, and events outside the official narrative created an immediate tension between the obligations of historical accuracy and the interests of people still living, or of families whose members were no longer alive but whose privacy retained a kind of weight even decades after the fact. The estate had always operated with a strong sense of responsibility toward Elvis's legacy. And that responsibility did not simply dissolve in the face of new information. The question was not whether to handle things carefully, but how to define what careful handling required when the material in question had been kept out of sight for specific and still only partially understood reasons. The recorded material occupied a space of its own in these deliberations. Unheard recordings connected to one of the most celebrated musical careers in history carried an obvious weight that went beyond the personal or the historical. There were questions about what the recordings contained, whether they were finished or unfinished, whether they had been stored away by choice or by circumstance, and what obligations existed toward them as musical documents. Unfortunately, those questions could not be answered until the recordings had been fully assessed, and that process was expected to take a significant amount of time. The possibility that the attic contained music that the world had never heard was one that everyone involved understood had implications far beyond the immediate situation. Storage decisions had to be made for everything that was not immediately entering an active assessment or preservation process. The attic itself was no longer a viable holding space, and the material needed to be distributed into environments where its condition could be properly monitored and maintained. Some items went into existing Graceland storage facilities that had been developed and managed over years for exactly this kind of purpose. Others required external specialist facilities, particularly the most fragile paper documents and the recorded media. In every case, the chain of custody was documented carefully, and access was restricted to the people directly involved in the assessment process. But the broader question of public disclosure remained unresolved as the work continued. There was no timetable attached to it, and the people making decisions were not operating under any obligation to move quickly. What had been sealed for 48 years was not going to be released carelessly, simply because it had finally been opened. The estate had always understood that Elvis's legacy was a living thing, shaped continuously by what was shared and how it was framed, and the material from the attic had the potential to reshape it in ways that required careful thought. Some of what had been found would eventually reach the public in some form. Some of it might not. The line between those two categories was not yet drawn, and the drawing of it was going to be one of the most consequential decisions the estate had faced in a very long time. So, what are your thoughts? Do you think Elvis would have wanted that attic sealed forever? Let us know your views in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.